Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. Today is a book club episode brought to us by Zondervan Publishers. And we are talking about the great dechurching. Who's leaving? Why are they going? And what will it take to bring them back? This book is written by Jim Davis and Michael Graham with Ryan Burge, and the foreword is by Colin Hansen, who we've had on the show before as well. So if you guys go to our show notes, click the Zondervan link. It'll take you to this book. Please get it. And then I'm going to read an endorsement. There's a couple endorsements for people we've had on the show before, Justin Holcomb and Ligon Duncan. I will read Justin Holcomb's endorsement of this book. He says this about the book: every church leader, either lay leader or ordained, needs to read this book to understand who is leaving churches, why they are leaving, and what it will take to bring them back. The great dechurching overflows with practical wisdom about the sobering reality of dechurching. While there is a top-level assessment of the numbers, the heart of the book is about the people we all know and love. I'm giving copies of this book to the clergy in the diocese where I serve and will assign it for the seminary courses I teach. So also on our show notes, if you guys check out some other links and helpful reminders and resources, there's a link to find a local church near your area. If you need help finding a church to call home, there's a NAPARC Church Finder link, and also just resources of how to communicate with us, reminders of where we are in social media world, and our YouTube page. These conversations are on YouTube, so if that's an easier platform for you guys. So yeah, we got a full house today. A lot of cooks in the kitchen, so we'll let Peter further introduce our guests today: Jim Davis, Michael Graham, and Ryan Burge.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce, and so bear with me as I read these bios. I'll try to read them fast so people can hear them fast. We got Jim Davis, who's teaching pastor at Orlando Grace Church and Acts 29 Church, hosts the As in Heaven podcast and the Gospel Coalition podcast network, and serves as a writer for the Dechurched Initiative. Jim writes frequently for the Gospel Coalition, Acts 29, and Family Life. He and his wife, Angela, speak for Family Life's Weekend to Remember, which I've actually been to once before, like 2 years ago, their marriage getaways. Michael Graham is program director at the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. He's also executive producer and writer for the As in Heaven podcast, received his MDiv at RTS in Orlando, member at Orlando Grace Church, where Jim Davis is a pastor at, married to Sara, and they have two kids. And Ryan Burge is an associate professor of political science at Eastern Illinois University, where he also serves as the graduate coordinator, I think, in the MA program. He's authored over 30 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters alongside 4 books about religion and politics in the U.S. He's written for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. He's also appeared in an NBC documentary on Frontal with Samantha Bee, as well as 60 Minutes, which called him one of the country's leading data analysts on religion and politics. He's served as pastor in the American Baptist Church for over 20 years, has been married to his wife, Jacqueline, for over 15 years, and they have 2 boys. And I'm going to stop talking for a little bit because I'm not out of breath, but it's a pleasure to have all 3 of you guys on our show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. So, first question, beyond our bio, and I'll start where the bios start. So, Jim, I'll start with you. Let our listeners know a little bit more about yourselves beyond just the kind of academic and church bio stuff.
Well, that merges well with how we started this project. Mike and I both grew up in Orlando. At the time, he's now with Keller Center, but he was our executive pastor, and we began to just kind of look at the context in which we live. And we noticed that a lot of the people who live in our context, the people who don't go to church used to go to church. We saw a Barna study, I think it was done in 2017 and came out in 2018, that it said the Orlando metropolitan area had the same percentage of evangelicals as New York City and Seattle. So we began to just start to wonder, why do we feel so different than New York City and Seattle? And that's when we began to identify this type of dechurched person, where New York City and Seattle are unchurched. And so we were just 2 pastors trying to understand the context in which we live, Of course, you're in one Orange County, we're in the other Orange County, and you have Disneyland, we have Disney World, we both have Universal, but even so, we our contexts feel very different.
What area is cheaper? What area is more expensive? We'll let people figure out which one's which.
Yeah. COVID was very different for our two Orange counties.
It's very true.
So that's I don't know how much you want to know about us, but that was kind of our lived experience that we've seen our city change a lot over the past 40 years. And so that began this conversation that turned into something with more of a national scope.
Gotcha. Yeah. Mike, what about you?
I'm not really sure what the question is. You might have to edit this part. Like, were you going more for like personal bio or like backstory on like the research?
Personal bio.
Well, I'm sorry then.
Both work. Both feed into the next question. I want to get to know you guys as people, and then go into the next question.
Yeah, I mean, so I grew up as a math science geek. I was doing research, and I did like the science fair thing and like the AP stuff. So I was just this little nerd. Growing up, I'm still pretty little. I grew up in fundamentalist in SBC dispensational background.
Yep.
As a result of that, the gospel wasn't super clear to me, and so I was an atheist for a little while, and then. An inductive Bible study in Galatians was what kind of was the front door for me for understanding the gospel and a bit of the entrance into the Reformed world in college. Was on staff with Crew after undergrad. Was supposed to do quantitative finance in undergrad, but then got had other plans and ended up studying religious studies and philosophy. Ended up overseas, like Jim, after college, on staff with Crew in Italy. That was an awesome experience because we got to see a deeply post-Christian society that had been thoroughly kind of dismantled and deconstructed, where none of the institutions really worked up front, and we got to see the gospel actually work. We saw a lot of fruit over there, so our current cultural moment doesn't really scare us. We've already seen it, If you think if you don't like Trump or whatever, or if you do, Italy had its own version of that, which was actually in Berlusconi, who actually died like 2 months ago.
Oh, interesting.
But we've already lived through all that, and so that was interesting. And then came back to the States, did seminary at RTS Orlando, and then did some church planting, and had a second career in finance for a bit, and then been doing largely operations in the local church, and now at the Gospel Coalition's Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, we lost Ryan Burge for a little bit. We'll see if he comes back. But yeah,
Would you like me to answer the question correctly? I don't have whatever you want to do.
No, actually, I think your answer was perfect.
Okay.
We'll get into more of it as we get into the questions too.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the first question I have is, just to kick things off, starting from the basics, why did each of you feel the need? What was the need and motivation to write a book in 2023 about dechurching? And you just explained the difference between non-churched or unchurched versus dechurched. So there's some differences there. Is this a big wake-up call to the church? Who exactly is a dechurched person?
Well, so how did we get here? As we began to learn our own context, we realized that Orlando's not unique in this situation, this phenomenon. So the way we define a dechurched person is someone who used to go to church, some house of worship, at least once a month, and now goes less than once a year. And so we really originally it was a project for our podcast. And we realized there's no real data out there. So anecdotally, when my wife was getting a counseling degree at RTS, she had Justin Holcomb as her professor, and she wanted to do her final research paper on dechurching. And he said, "That sounds great, but there's nothing to research. You can't do this." And so we had a few of those kind of data points where our team was discussing, well, what would it look like do this research. And we had recently become acquainted with Ryan Burge's work. He's a top tier social scientist. It just does great data, great research. And so in phase one, we really wanted to prove or disprove this thesis. We're currently in the largest and fastest religious shift in the history of our country. Because anecdotally, we felt like this could be true. And he and Dr. Paul Jupe, another social scientist, with that first phase of the study, proved that in fact we are. Whether you look at it by percentage or number, we are in the largest and fastest religious shift in the history of our country. So back to the end of your question, we don't presume that this one study or this one book is fixing the problems. What we want to do is, you mentioned a wake-up call. We want to start a national conversation where people with different experiences and giftings can build on this, to where as a church we are having the right kinds of conversations.
Yeah, Mike, what about you?
Yeah, the biggest pain point for us was, okay, if this is almost half of our city that is dechurched, as of 2018 it was 42% according to Barna. Well, we had no actionable information pastorally. So, if behind ethnicity and gender, the largest demographic in our entire city is people who used to go to church, well, we need to know a lot more about who these people are and why they left, and before we can know what it looks like to minister effectively. So for us, it just kind of boiled down to, like, Jim and I and our elders, we felt like we couldn't do our job until we had more information. And so we just needed more information. And so, and we had, mechanisms with which to get that information. So, if we need this information and we need it to do our jobs, well, let's go out there and get it. So that's what we did.
It sounds
so
super easy. Yeah. It's like, let's just go do this.
I mean, necessity is the mother of all invention. It was really just kind of necessity that kind of drove us to do this. And plus we had, we knew at a minimum, we at least, what we learned we could share through this audio vehicle of the As in Heaven podcast. It wasn't until we got through like the third phase of the data that we're like, oh my gosh, it would be like irresponsible for us to only put this out there in audio format. And actually we had a couple different publishers who had gotten wind that we were that we were sitting on all this information, and they started some conversations with us. And so we never intended to write a book.
It was actually Justin Holcomb. He was like, after we did a couple phases of the study, he was like, "Do you realize what you're sitting on?" and he
this
was
pile
the
of
one
pure
who
gold. He's like, you got to share this stuff with people.
We were like, we're just doing this for our church and the podcast, and he was the one, I think, who made some publishing connections and kind of moved us that direction, because we'd never written a book and we didn't know what we were doing. And that, I mean, this is new from that perspective.
Yeah. So talking more specifically about your your individual / communal help for this book, or what you guys bring to the table, what from your perspective and your work, what do you bring to the table, each of you that brings to the table, that makes this somewhat unique? Because this is, I mean, it's not usual that you get kind of 3 scholars into one book, or writing a book on Dechurching, like you said. One person's so good at data-driven work, one person's so good at the kind of the theological ramifications. So what do you guys bring into this? Because it's not often you get a book that brings statistical and theological research into one.
Yeah, so I'll take this one. So Ryan is kind of the linchpin with respect to data, right? I don't know of anybody who does religion data better than him.
That's all he posts about on Twitter, and they're fantastic posts.
Yeah,
follow his Substack.
It's
amazing.
It's a must subscribe.
Yeah, okay. It is huge.
His website's graphsabout.religion.com.
Yep.
And that's where his Substack lives as well. Anyways, so, and then Ryan, is good friends with Paul Jupe, whose expertise is in political science, particularly in survey study design. And so we wanted to do a survey that would be intertextual and use all the same definitions and would be able to communicate effectively with all of the other data that has, been on other large things like the GSS, the CES, the PDES, and other large, large ongoing, the GSS has been going since the early 70s, asking the same questions in the same way with the same definitions. So we can compare those things, kind of historically. So that's what Paul brought to the team, was the expertise, there. Ryan's job was in data analytics, and working with the analyzing the data set after it was kind of been created. So with that, he did all the machine learning, heavy lifting, and the development of the various different profiles. And then Ryan was also helpful from a data interpretation standpoint. We have all these, this massive, data set,
what does this mean?
Yeah. What does this mean? What does this look to make sense of it? How does this relate to like various narratives and debates inside sociology of religion, all those kinds of things. So Ryan was very helpful for us in that. As I mentioned, in the like longer form bio, like I was building mathematical models for stock market prediction in the mid 90s. And even, this is when I was in high school. And, I delivered papers at Johns Hopkins University at 16, to this end. I was supposed to go to MIT to do quantitative finance. But my dad's $40,000 a year of income was
didn't quite cut for MIT. Yeah.
It was too much money for the FAFSA, so I didn't get any financial aid.
Okay.
So I've always lived in the intersection of like operations, business, and math and spreadsheets and ministry. And so I'm kind of like a good bridge between Ryan and Paul and Jim. And Jim and I, if you guys like, just if you want to know what Jim and I like worked like together at Orlando Grace Church, think Moneyball. So like if you've seen people are probably more familiar with the film than the book, but like Jim is Billy Bean, and I'm
looks like him too.
Brad Pitt.
I can see resemblance. Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm
doing
the better looking side.
If I had a nickel for every time someone made that mistake.
And I'm like the Jonah Hill, like like I would be most happy looking at spreadsheets. Jim's great with people and those kinds of things. So I think that's kind of how I would explain like our team. And when it comes to the book, so I wrote the chapters primarily on the profiles that were a bit more data centric. So chapters 3 through 7, and the chapters 9 and 12 on relational wisdom, and the spiritual formation, the stuff on information diet. So I'm better like on analysis. Jim's better on like practical wisdom, pastoral wisdom, and what did these things mean for us, kind of interpersonally, and what do those things mean for the church?
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, we are, I was thinking, I didn't tell you this in my bio, but when I was at Florida State, my goal was to be governor of the state of Florida. And I wasn't a Christian. And actually, when I ran for senior,
DeSantis right now, this would have been.
Well, it's funny. I had it planned out. I knew when I was going to run for governor, and it would have been the year that DeSantis ran, which is funny. But I actually, my senior class campaign at Florida State, my campaign manager was Representative Matt Gaetz. But there's so much about that that's interesting. But
I'll write you in for the vote next time. Don't worry.
But then I became a Christian, and like my desires were so different, and I didn't want to be governor anymore. But there were some ways that God had made me like wanting to be around people and that kind of stuff that He's really redeemed and used in a very different way.
Awesome.
So
we're a great team.
Yeah, no, I love the Moneyball.
That's a perfect reference. I like that.
Yeah. So we talked about the definition of the dechurched person, and they had some sort of affiliation with the church prior. So just kind of open it up to more understanding more about those people, those individuals. What kind of common denominators, if there is one, if that you could say that took them away from a church? You know, who are the categories of people leaving the church, and what is the main reason or common denominator that people are leaving the church, if you had to narrow it down?
Yeah, well, the first thing we wanted to show is that there's not one main common denominator, that de-churched people are not monolithic. You know, if you just read social media pundits and the New York Times, you would think that every de-churched person has deconverted, hates the church, had a bad experience. And through our research, the number one reason for leaving church is I moved. Like, so that just goes against the narrative that you hear.
It's a little simpler than you think it is.
And it's very different than you think it is. So the first thing we did is divide de-church into two categories at the highest level. The casually de-churched who left the church because they moved, because they got a divorce, had a kid, kids got involved in sports, you know, COVID, those kind of things. They unintentionally left the church. There was no pain point. That's 30 million of the 40 million people.
Oh, wow.
And then there are the other 10 million have a pain point, and they're different kinds of pain points, but there is a pain point and they intentionally left the church. So then in phase 3, we really wanted to dive into what's going on in evangelicalism. Again, this is birthed out of our church and our context. Everything that we've done has been birthed out of just trying to serve our local church. And we never expected it to take on a national scope, but it did. And when we looked at, well, first I'll say mainline and Roman Catholic de-churching looks very similar. It began in the 90s.
That was super shocking to me reading this book, because that's not what you hear again, at least from more conservative-minded people. They assume it's very different.
Yeah, so it began in earnest in the 1990s. The fall of the Soviet Union was a big deal. The rise of the internet, some things going to politics, and so in the 90s, you began to see the mainline and Roman Catholics on the secular left de-churching. Then you fast forward, and now the secular right is de-churching at about almost twice the pace of the secular left. And that's largely out of evangelicalism. So what we did then, and the heart, again, we want people to be able to see these profiles and understand these profiles to understand what type of de-churched person are you looking at. So we have these 5 profiles that, as Mike said, we didn't create these. This is machine learning. This is an algorithm developing them based on common answers. And so this is very reliable from our 7,000 participants and 600 data points. But in very brief form, de-churched evangelicals divided up into cultural Christians. This is, imagine the person who didn't leave with any pain point. They might come to church on Christmas or Easter, not twice in the same year, but they might show up. They have a favorable view, but like 1% of them believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that they probably were never a Christian to begin with. This is, of the 15 million evangelicals who have de-churched, this is about 8 million people. Then you have de-churched mainstream evangelicals. This is the person that de-churched casually, kids, sports, COVID, whatever, but they're probably still a believer. It really seems like they're 98% of them believe that Jesus is the Son of God. They have a high view of the Bible. Their orthodoxy scores are higher than those who still go to church. So in terms of like just taking those groups, they're going to be very different in how you bring them back. You know, one group never really was in, so the other group, it's really just an invitation, and we've been shocked when we can identify these people. How easy it is for them to come back because they're already believers and they know they should. Then we have the ex-evangelical, and that's a term that is confusing because it's used in different ways, but we're defining it in a way, and it makes a lot of sense to use it this way. This is somebody who left the church because of a pain point. This is about 2.5 million people. But again, they're probably still Christians. Like, was it 97%, Mike, that of them who would say that Jesus is the Son of God?
Yeah, these numbers are shocking when you read the book. It's like these people have a strong understanding of the faith. And that's, sorry to interject real quick.
No, yeah.
It's de-churching doesn't necessarily mean, it can mean, but doesn't necessarily mean non-Christian. Right. And there's a big difference in the way we minister to these people. So while the de-churched mainstream evangelical, all they need is a nudge, the ex-evangelical is going to need a lot more. Be in your home, get to know them, listen, understand their story, kind of the tools that a counselor would employ. And then the last group in evangelicalism is the BIPOC group. And what's fascinating is we hid race and ethnicity. What does BIPOC mean for those who hear that?
Yeah,
don't know what that means?
Black, indigenous, people of color.
Okay.
So We hid race as a fact and ethnicity as a factor for the machine learning to see, but still it produced this group that was 0% white. And so this group, there were some unique pain points about many of them growing up in as a minority in a majority space church. And so that came out they dechurched typically not long after they left home. But what was really interesting is this group was by far the most educated and most had the most income of any group, but their orthodoxy scores were low, and it seems like not as low as the cultural Christian, but it seems like that many of them were not believers to begin with.
Oh, this is fascinating. And you mentioned the city of Seattle earlier. Just a personal note on that. I lived there for 11 years, and I can see how the difference is as somebody that's never really was in a church setting, didn't grow up as a Christian, versus what you're describing. And also based on the categories you're describing, there is, I feel like, some hope, because more often than not, you're probably just, people are just waiting for an invitation from a neighbor or friend to say, hey, do you want to go to church with me? And be invited to a church that they, so that is,
you get like a radicalized media message from whoever they may be and saying, all the nuns are against the church and they're fighting. And but on the ground, like you said, it's not what you hear from people. That's maybe what you're told, but it's not what you actually see.
Yeah, so 51% of evangelicals are willing to come back to church today, dechurched evangelicals. In the dechurched mainstream evangelical group that I talked about, 100% of them are willing to come back today by their own
These
admission.
are mind-boggling. Yeah, there's so much in this book. You're like, wait, I got to read that sentence or that statistic again, because that goes, like, so much of it goes against the grain of what you think is happening, because that's what we're fed is happening, or that's what we assume.
And one of the reasons it's so important is because these dechurched Christians, as we see it, what do we think is going to happen to their children and grandchildren? The children of the dechurched will likely be unchurched. So there is this generational opportunity. And while it's hopeful, it's urgent that we engage.
100%.
I want to say this too. The internet functions like a funhouse mirror.
Yep.
I know, like the little.
I love your analogies.
The county fair, it's like certain things end up larger or smaller than what they are in real life. And the only way to combat a funhouse mirror is with an actual mirror. Right? So you need to see these things side by side. And so what we've tried to do is get an actual mirror of flat glass. And we felt like the best way to do that was through data. And so I think to critique just about everybody who's invested in this conversation, I feel, well, first on the positive, I think everybody is partially right.
Sure.
I think just about everybody is also partially wrong. And so those who are probably more on the left end of this conversation want to overly blame local churches and or white evangelicals generically to what is going on. Now, are there plenty of own goals and plenty of things that are there that were totally avoidable, that that are big problems? Yes. Racism, problem. Misogyny, problem. Clergy scandal, problem. Sexual abuse or abuse of any kind, problems. Okay, don't want to minimize that. All big deals. Okay? However, on the right, I think the funhouse mirror digitally looks like the blaming of the culture, right?
Culture is the problem, and culture's been infiltrating.
Right. And whether the culture there means, like the LGBTQIA plus, that, or just secular progressivism in general, or expressive individualism, those kinds of things. I would say that there's a little bit more of an overemphasis there. That's where the funhouse mirror is exaggerated in terms of what's going on there. I would say what both groups need is a little bit of the other other side's perspective, but perhaps what I would add as a Lego brick on top of both of those things is how shifts in technology from a macro standpoint
have impacted all of the above.
Hmm.
In other words, technology has radically reshaped on how humans' hearts are, how we are formed and shaped, whether that's spiritually or in any way. And those things have all of us a bit scrambled. I don't know if there's any time period in human history where the ways in which humans are formed and shaped has shifted so rapidly. And so I don't think that we are super cognizant of the ways in which of how human, forming and shaping has just changed so quickly, and the extent to which algorithms are influencing that, the extent to which our self-curated information diets are, are influencing all of that. So I think that everybody is underestimating the role that those macro forces of just shifts in technology and how does our heart get, how do desires get, kind of help me out with the right word here, Jim. Like
disordered.
Well, yeah, ordered or disordered. Like how do the desires of our heart grow now?
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
They grow very differently now than what they did in the first half of my life.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I think the ways in which those pathways have changed is kind of the soil on which all of this is kind of coming out of.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that's been really underestimated in any direction of where people have been approaching this conversation. I think definitionally also, this conversation is a total mess. Okay. So many of the technical terms mean different things to the different rooms that you're walking into. People are conflating technical terms all the time. So, I mean, here's some technical terms that people mess up. Okay. Church should be relatively easy. You go to church at least once a month. Dechurched, you go to church less than once per year, but you used to go on a monthly basis. Okay, relatively straightforward. But people don't know what unchurched means. Unchurched means you never really went to church. Okay. And then disaffiliation. Well, what does disaffiliation mean? Well, that means that you used to see yourself from a self-identification standpoint as one way, but now you no longer see yourself as, say maybe you saw yourself as Christian, but now you don't. And then you have, in sociology of religion, you have belief, behavior, and belonging. And each one of those things can be like on a slider from 0 to 100, in terms of your beliefs, in terms of, your behaviors, your ethics, and then your belonging, the extent to which you are or are not connected to a, embodied community. And so people want to treat belief, behavior, and belonging as if they're light switches, right? Of like, oh, belief is on or belief is off, or, behavior's on or behavior's off, or, you're in or you're out in terms of, community. But more often than not, these are on dimmer switches, right? And it just looks different on those things. And so most of the narratives that come out of these kind of conversations just kind of treat belief, behavior, and belonging as if they're one thing, and they treat them as if it's like a light switch that's just binary and on or off. But the reality is just far more complicated, and that's why we wanted big information on these things so we could develop profiles, and then so we can build some story around some of those profiles, so people can wrap their minds around. It's not just as simple as I sent my kid off to secular university and now they don't love Jesus anymore, or any of the other, numerous, tropes, myths, and the like.
Yeah, totally. That's helpful.
Cool. Next question is kind of geared more towards Ryan. I know he's not here right now, but
he texted me his internet gave out and he couldn't. I don't know what happened.
Oh, all good.
I can do my best Ryan impression.
That's right. Yeah, we'll have Michael imbibe the identity of Ryan right now.
Good deal. So what are some of the most important statistics and data? Because we talked about that. Ryan really put a lot of hard work of he's the best. He puts a lot of that statistic and data into this book that you guys could share just in this conversation a little bit easier to kind of whet the palate for the audience of some nuggets. So clarity, structure, really looking towards the gravity, the soberness, the importance of your book. any fun statistics or data?
Yeah,
that you
so I
can
mean, a
bring
few
up?
things that stuck out to us. We actually just had an article at the Gospel Coalition come out on 5 misconceptions of dechurching. But one of the fascinating things is that the more educated a Christian is, the more likely they are to stay in church, especially in evangelicalism. So only 3% of evangelicals with master's degrees have dechurched.
Which was just like, what? This is not what you heard.
That's 1/8 the rate of the rest of evangelicals.
Yeah, which is just.
And it goes against what I always heard higher secular education is taking our children away.
Yeah, like university is the cemetery of belief. That's where all your professors come at you with everything they got, and you're like, I got nothing. I'm just gonna go away from the church.
In defense of people that have repeated that trope, the most likely time you are to dechurch is between ages 13 and 30, and especially 18 to 30.
Yeah.
And so I can see why people would confuse, correlation and causation.
Exactly.
What will people do during this time period? Well, they go off to university. But it really doesn't appear like that university is the primary cause of kind of what's going on there. Another interesting thing data-wise was the relationship of class and income as it pertains to dechurching. Dechurching exists more on the extremes of the class spectrum than in the middle. And so what I mean by that, at the very, very upper end of upper income, and then lower middle class up through down to lower class is kind of impacting things disproportionately. And so, some of the thoughts that we have on that, relate to 1, institutions, and then 2, casual dechurching. So let me unpack that briefly. So institutions in America are across the board declining in trust. There was a Gallup study 2 months ago. They've been tracking 14 different institutions in the United States for decades and decades of what public trust is in those things. Of those, only the U.S. military has increased in public trust over the last 15 years. And religion has only had the 4th worst decline during that. So relative to other institutions, it's actually not doing all that bad. But what I said before about technology and the soil, the internet is kind of a place where if you want to gain an audience, well, you just gain an audience by increasing distrust in a particularly large institution. That's the fastest way to gain an audience. Strip mine an institution for, likes, clicks, or listens. And so I think, that's something that's going on in terms of institutional trust, kind of across the board. But related to that, if you want to build a nuclear family and go and finish high school and or a college degree, and you have children after you get married,
you're on the success route.
Among millennials, like 98% of people who do that live above the poverty line. And so America does have some pretty well established ladders, but if you don't follow those paths, America might not work super well for you.
No.
And its institutions might not work well for you. And included in those institutions is just religion. And so
they're built for that ladder, essentially.
Right. And so consider that if most of the dechurching, 3/4 of it, is for casual reasons, usually built around shifts in life circumstances, moving, family changes, inconvenience, those different kinds of things, well, it only stands to reason that if you don't have a lot of socioeconomic buffer, in other words, if you don't have good fiscal margin, then a shift in life is going to, by nature, reorder your habits and rhythms.
It's going to disrupt you.
Just per your hierarchy of needs, you got to feed your family before you can go to church. So if you're not able to do that, then it only makes sense that shifts in life are going to disproportionately impact dechurching. So that was like another area for us that was that I think everybody should find interesting. And I think that is a clarion call for all of us to be cognizant of that. And I think every local church has to decide, what does that mean for us as we engage in our particular context, and what does it look like to help people get on the ladders of society, and what does it look like to help us get people, connected back to, because it's like, if you get disconnected from social institutions where, church is a good place for upward mobility, even if you don't care about Jesus or whatever, I mean, it's not a bad thing
it's got great networking capabilities.
Yeah, it's not a bad thing to have deep relationships with people who are in a lot of different things.
That's the Orange County, California way. It's you go to church to build connections.
So, I mean, I think those are things that, and so if you're dealing with people who are on the, the bottom third of, per capita income in the United States, and they're getting disconnected from a major social institution, it's going to have a lot of cascading implications that aren't just church centric. I mean, those people are going to continue to struggle in life and all the things that are downstream from that. So there's a lot of implications here for the social safety net, for upward mobility in differences in class on the upper end and the lower end, and all ethnicity in addition to this also exacerbates all of those things and adds one more layer to that whole conversation.
Yeah. So you've already touched on this topic a little bit. I want to go into it because there are going to be, like we've already talked about, one of them being the education level and the rate of dechurching. There's going to be some statistics and some meanings pulled from statistics that are going to shock people and say, like, I did not expect this from these statistics. I, in fact, thought the exact opposite of what the statistics show out. So what are some of those things where maybe they're, like you said, cultural tropes? This is something we expect to happen, but actually, according to data, it is the precise opposite of what we expect to have. Something in education, race, and level of theological acumen. Some other things like this. You talk about some of the findings that might catch people off guard.
Well, sorry, I just got distracted real quick.
Yeah, I can take this one in terms of like the lowest hanging fruit.
Yeah,
I mean, the most shocking thing should be people moving.
Okay.
When somebody moves, that's an emergency. Okay. And you're talking about like just the easiest things that you can do. Well, when somebody's moving from your community to a new community, and I'm talking whether you're clergy or you're just this person's friend, like at church, well, help them find a good new church, in their new context. Go on the internet, find 2 to 5 good options, start listening to some sermons, develop a good list of questions to ask, that's, that gets deeper into the kinds of stuff you see on a church website.
Yeah.
And, start to see like what's a good fit. And then if you're in that person's life, whether you're a, clergy or just a friend, stay in touch with them and make sure that, follow through with them until they, find a good place to land from a local church standpoint. So I think we were really surprised at how significant stuff like moving, family changes, and just inconvenience.
Yeah, something so simple. You just don't expect that to be the leading factor.
Yeah, that was like the number 3 factor. I mean, those are the top 3 factors. Is
or a new job.
Yeah.
One of the, and just knowing the city that you're in, is your city a city people are moving to or leaving? And there's a lot in between there. I mean, our Orlando is like the 3rd fastest growing city in the United States now, which is honestly kind of sad for me, is like rural fishing and hunting Florida goes away, but that's how it's happening. And so we've been thinking about how do we mobilize, who are the first responders, per se, the school administrators, the realtors who are going to meet these people first. And so we've been having conversations about mobilizing those people, because if you're moving, you're at risk. Or if you're in a city that people are leaving, well, how do you follow them, stay with them until they land and plug into a church? And it's been really encouraging, even recently, seeing some of these new people come in, and they're new to the town, and they're here because their pastor said, go check this church out. It's just so sweet seeing pastors walking with people as they move. It sounds like such a small deal, but this is the number one point, the number one time that people are dechurching. I think they're just real opportunities for churches in terms of what we call medium walls. You have some churches where it's just total anonymity, and I know I'm going to 2 extremes here, and there's a lot in between, but total anonymity. It's about entertainment and maybe serving on Sunday, very little discipleship. We don't touch topics that might scare people off. And on the other side, there's like the really high cultish walls, the shiny, happy people kind of walls that protecting our kids from the sin outside, but are never really equipping them to go out and live in the world. But as a church, we're given some sort of walls in the New Testament, whatever you want to call those walls, as a way to call our people to biblical standards and to equip them and shepherd them without being a cult or the Holy Spirit over them, lording over them. So I just, that's another thing that really seeing why people were leaving churches between 13 and 30, that became very, very clear. People said church wasn't a place I could express doubt. I didn't feel comfortable asking real questions. The messages weren't relevant to my life. Those are the kind of things we heard.
Yeah. And maybe just a quick little side note, personal story. So I grew up in Orange County, Tustin, which is a small city, small for California, city in Orange County. And we're like effectively the birthplace of mega churches. So the biggest churches people have heard of come from the Orange County area. And I went to Biola for my undergrad. And then both my wife and I went to Biola for undergrad. And just about everybody we know has dechurched in some sort of way because they went, and I'm not poo-pooing on mega churches in general, but they did have the anonymity where nobody plugged them into a church where they were moving after college, whatever it was. And so it was post-college, I saw just a ton of dechurching because they went to these big kind of cool churches where they had almost no relationship with the pastors on staff. And when they moved, and it shocked us, like, oh, we knew you as Christians when we were at Biola. What happened to you? Like, oh, I just kind of fell away. But it makes sense now that there was anonymity and there was nothing to plug them in to wherever they moved. It wasn't like they made this big decision after Biola. I was like, you know what? Now that I thought about it really hard, I'm not a Christian anymore. It's just there's no help.
Well, and we're having conversations at our church right now. The Lord has us in a season of growth, but we're having like how there is a size at which we can't do our philosophy of ministry and know people and care people. It's not that everybody has to know everybody, but there's a size where we have to be using that momentum to plant churches. And not that you need to wait to then to do it, but it's just, yes, you get, I'm not vilifying mega churches, but you get to a certain size and there are things that we're not willing to sacrifice in terms of the way we do ministry. There's inherent difficulties just by the fact that you can't get to know people at the level that you can at a small church.
Yeah. And if I may, this is making it clear that it's so important for the networking of denominations working, like whether it's Acts 29. Peter and I both used to be in Acts 29 church, and they're all over. When I moved from Seattle to Orange County, there was a kind of a my pastor in Seattle told me, I know so-and-so in Orange County, Acts 29. I plugged in. That made it easier to transfer. Also, alumni from schools like Peter went to, Westminster, California. There's pastors in other cities. The denomination that we're part of now, where I'm in OPC. So when I moved to Idaho, my pastor in my OPC now knows an OPC pastor up there. That handing off,
like you said, there's such simple steps, but we forget that this is like the leading factor of people dechurching because we don't take what we like, kind of like what are assumed steps. Like we assume, oh, of course you're going to find a church over there because you've always gone to church. Therefore, you're going to find a church, not intentionally handing off the baton to somebody else because we've assumed it.
Well, and then with the rise of online worship, which I think if you look at the way that Luke and Paul and others in the New Testament use the word worship, it's embodied.
Exactly.
You cannot use the word in most of the cases without assuming you're with other people. So the term online worship is kind of an oxymoron. And in 2021, we cut our live stream. Now, we're not anti-technology. We put our sermons online. We have a podcast, but it's just like we want to make it clear this is not that.
We did the same exact thing. We had a debate whether we're going to have video of it. And I was like, no, we'll have audio, but we're not going to have video where people like, it's just an easier way of like kind of saying, yes, I'm still going to this, but like, you're not.
Well, the way I've described it, it's like a deployed soldier having a Zoom relationship with his wife. Maybe necessary for a time. Maybe, better than nothing, but it's nowhere in the ballpark of ideal.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So what I actually want to do, I want to bridge into my next question with another one, because there, and Michael, you talked about this, and I think these are the chapters that you wrote. Like you said, there's 4 profiles that are top. If you can just go into a little bit of what the 4 profiles are, because I think this bridges into the last kind of practical section of what do we do with some of these people. So who are the people that you, as a statistical model, kind of spewed out its information? You guys built these 4 profiles. What are those 4 profiles, maybe in summary? And then I'll transition to my next question after that.
Yeah, and Jim touched on a little bit of this. So in, earlier, the 4 profiles being, first, the cultural Christians. These are 8 million people, a little bit more than male and female, who left around age 40, married, upwardly mobile. America's working for them. They're doing stuff like travel baseball, and
they sound like regular old people. They're not like crazy anti-Christians. They're just regular people.
No, they're just regular Americans, and they probably were not Christians to begin with. Yeah. But there's a lot
of mad about it.
No, not mad.
No, they're not against the church. Yeah, they're just not.
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunity there relationally, and 48% of them are willing to come back today. Yeah. So then the second group, the mainstream dechurched evangelicals. This group, more female than male, but the same age. Cultural Christians, they left about a little over a decade ago, but the mainstream evangelicals, they left in the last 3 years by and large. A little bit more female than male. Income's a little bit less than the first group, but they're doing fine. Again, both these 2 groups are monolithically white, 98%, and then 91% for the mainstream evangelicals. So the mainstream evangelicals, these people look regenerate, and they really do seem like they want to come back to church right now. And if you ask them, so one thing I would just say is, for most of the casually dechurched, if you're going to encourage somebody who's casually dechurched to come back to church, most of those people are actually going to think probably more positively of you than not. Going into this, we kind of assumed that inviting somebody to church was something that was potentially a relationship ending conversation.
Friendship breaker. Yeah, I think that's how everybody thinks of it. Yeah,
and one of the most hopeful things is that it doesn't really look that way. Even with all the different macro shifts and whatnot, it doesn't really look that way. The third profile, the ex-evangelicals, so 100% of the mainstream evangelicals are willing to return to evangelical church today. 0% of the ex-evangelicals are willing to return to church today. That's why we called them ex-evangelicals, because they were done with going to an evangelical church.
Yeah.
Now, about 21% of them don't want to go to any church of any sort, but almost 80% seem like they're open to going to another type of Christian church.
Okay.
So
Gotcha.
There's opportunities there, for the various other, Christian,
not back to what they're used to, but back to something different.
Right. Yeah. Mainline, Black Protestant, Orthodox, Catholic, whatever.
Gotcha.
So there's a lot of openness there, and the orthodoxy scores were a bit higher than what we expected.
That was kind of shocking too.
There's lessons there. I think that most of the ex-evangelicals are less monolithic than what people previously thought.
Yeah.
I think the percentages, this is where the funhouse mirror is kind of coming in online. Yep. I think the assumption was that most ex-evangelicals have deconstructed their actual beliefs.
Yeah.
But it doesn't appear that as many of them have as what people previously thought.
Yeah, there's more orthodoxy than you had thought on the front end.
There's a lot of vestigial Christianity there that's still there, after the fact. So that was interesting as well. And that group, if you're going to minister to them, they're allergic to racism, misogyny, abuse, and political partisanship. 58% of ex-evangelicals are political independent. So you can't send them to, either red church or blue church.
They want neither. Yeah.
So, and then the BIPOC group, endlessly fascinating group. Of the 2.5 million people who left, almost 1.25 million of them are extremely affluent Black men. Yeah. So very upwardly mobile, and just they dechurched the soonest in the late 90s, right before the turn of the millennium. So I would think that their orthodoxy scores would have been higher if we were polling them, 20 years ago, within a couple of years of having left. So, but I don't know what the half-life is of orthodoxy after you leave church,
Sure.
but it can't, I don't expect it to trend upwards, right? So, but yeah, just an endlessly fascinating, group of people. The most allergic to racism was the ex-evangelicals, and then interestingly enough, the mainstream dechurched evangelicals.
Yeah.
Third-
We assume
third
it's
is
the BIPOC, but it's not.
You'd think it would be the BIPOC group, but it wasn't.
It's the
Yeah.
two with the highest orthodoxy scores.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Those who still hold, like what Mike said, to the highest levels of Orthodox Christianity, the ones who are most against some of these things, because they're still kind of swimming in these cultural waters.
Real quick too, just for clarification of definitions, can you guys describe for the audience what maintaining orthodoxy means? Because that could be kind of a vague term for some of our audience that's new to
What are you
stuff.
talking about for That's a good question. What are you talking about for orthodoxy?
Yeah,
Basic
so
Nicene. Or go ahead.
Nicene Creed level Christianity. So what are your views on the Bible, the Trinity,
Is
the
Jesus God?
the humanity and divinity of Jesus,
Yeah.
Sinlessness of Jesus, the resurrection of the dead.
Yep.
So those are the primary things that we're looking at.
Yeah, that's a good clarifying question. So second to last question, as we sort of start concluding, is what, and Jim, I want to kind of direct this more towards you, kind of being the practical outwork. Is what, with this information, what do pastors, what do lay leaders, what do members start doing and say, okay, yeah, we've got this Dechurch. What do we start doing?
Well, I think there are a number of, first, look in a normal mirror, not a funhouse mirror, is a good thing for churches. So how do we assess both the back door and the front door?
Yeah.
Because there's very different conversations. On the back door, what does it look like? Are we doing exit interviews? Are we listening to the people who are leaving? Are we knowing why? Would be good places to start. Or
it's scary if you're a church to have an exit interview. I was like, I'm about to get the riot act.
Well, in our context, people know, hey, when you leave, we want to bless you. This is not, we want to pray for you. Yeah. We want to learn from your experience.
Exit interviews are a must. If you're clergy and you're listening to this, truth is your friend.
Yeah.
And you got to listen to people. Sorry.
What are as Jim knows just as well, one of your fears as a preacher is A, how did I preach? Do people like my preaching? And then B, do people like the church? Those are the two things you just you got to fear hearing from your congregation, but you need to hear this stuff from your congregation.
Well, and full disclosure, between 2018 and 2021, 80% of our church left.
Yeah, it's not a fun time. Nope.
80% left, never to be, for various reasons, but it was helpful to know why they left, and our church is doing we're doing well now. We're very thankful, but knowing why people are leaving, processing it as church leaders, some of the things that's something we need to own, and other things that they're looking for something different than who we are. Totally. So I can get in the weeds here, but knowing who's leaving and why, or just knowing that people left. Some churches have no idea who's coming and going. Yeah. This is where those medium walls help out a lot. I think in the ways that we interact with people, I'd say two things. In the 20th century, we put a real emphasis on what's true, and Jesus is true, but that came at the expense often of what's good and beautiful. And you see it in our sermons, our apologetic methods, our evangelistic strategies. So it shouldn't surprise us that now people are asking, is Jesus ethical? Is he good? Are we bigots for being Christians? And so everything in the Bible is true, but don't hear me getting away from truth. But why is it good? Why is Jesus beautiful? And making sure that's a part of our discipleship and our ministry and our sermons. On the front door, as we're interacting with people who are dechurched, and so in some contexts like ours, it's going to be a lot more. Knowing what category they fall into. So if I meet a mainstream dechurched evangelical, I'm just inviting them to church, and I bet you there's a 90% chance they're going to come. But if I meet, if I meet an ex-evangelical, you're coming into my home first. I want to hear your story. I want to listen curiously.
It's not just a simple question of coming back. It's you got to get to know them.
Yeah, I mean, if
you got to get to know everybody, but that's more particularly so for those who are ex-evangelical.
And in probably 3 or 4 questions, I can be like, oh, okay, you did have a pain point. I see, and I want to understand more of it. And we dive in, more to like when there's been real abuse or trauma and things like that. There's steps that we want to really grow in our understanding of them. But just identifying who it is that we're interacting with. Is this person probably a Christian or not? So we have a number of different prescriptive things, but we want to make sure not to drift to extremes. But and then just knowing also that the cultural Christians and some mainline and Roman Catholic Dechurched, Jesus said in the parable of the weeds, there will be some in the kingdom who are not really in the kingdom. And so that's something that we need to this is not new. And then finally, something we've talked a lot about is just that the norm for God's people is that we would, most of God's people around the globe throughout Christianity have lived in a state of exile. And maybe, I'm not wishing exile and difficulties on people or the fall of the United States or anything like that, but I'm just saying, like, it maybe get uncomfortable. And this is what our brothers and sisters in the global East and South do. And as Christians, normally we exercise our influence from the margins of society and not the seat of power.
Yeah, totally.
To get like eminently practical, Peter and Nick, if you're listening to this and you are clergy or you are a like ministry leader, a small group leader or on a church staff or whatever, we built an entire other resource. So everybody should buy the book, read the book, because there's like, if any of this has been helpful for you, we go into like way more detail in the book. And it is eminently practical as well. But we built a whole other website entitled Dechurching.com. And on it, this is for like churches as institutions. Like, okay, let's say, I'm on staff with a church, and okay, this is a problem. This is a problem in our context, but we just need some rails to run on. So, the book is probably more geared towards individuals and then secondarily, to church. This is like a church-centric institution. So in it, we have a 20-point audit of, here's 20 areas that we know like dechurching is impacting, and where it's impacting at the institutional level of a local church, where it's basically preventable at the local church level. And so we have 20 areas. You can do the audit and the checklist. All that's the audit is there and totally free on the website. You can see the 20 question audit for your church. And then we built a resource for every one of those 20 areas. We built basically worksheets and a workflow of how to bring improvement in each of those areas and how that area is impacted by dechurching and how it relates to that. So that part's a paid part of that resource. But we built Dechurching.com for those who are just local churches who want to deal with this, because like it won't be enough from a tipping point standpoint for us to make progress only on the individual level. There's got to be institutional changes, and that's going to have to happen at the local church level. So we wanted to build a complementary resource that was institution centric.
So
that's all on Dechurching.com.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So my last question, I don't know if you guys have anything to end this, is actually different than what I sent over. My assumption is dechurched individuals wouldn't read the book, but there's a possibility to listen to a podcast. And we have a big range of people who listen to our show: clergy, Christian, non-Christian. Maybe if you can speak to the dechurched who are like, I'm moving, I'm scared, like Nick's moving in a few months. Somebody who's like moving is like, I'm scared this is going to be me. I'm scared that I'm going to be part of the statistic. If you can talk to those who are part of these groups, and maybe their pastors dropping the ball, maybe their church is dropping the ball, but maybe it's just some advice, some encouragement for those who are as part of this book, those who are being profiled.
Yeah, so let me take one answer for the casually dechurched and another answer for the casual dechurched casualty. So if you're at risk of casually dechurching, or you have, question I'm often asked is why is it bad if I read my Bible, have my quiet time, and don't go to church? Well, I think there's a reason. As we read the New Testament, there is no, Paul, for example, has no category for a privatized Christianity. It develops, even though you can be a Christian and not go to church, it makes us more flaky, more homogenous in our community. It inhibits the our ability to grow in loving each other when we're really just choosing to be around people who are more comfortable. But when we come together and we worship and we sing and we pray and we take the sacraments, I mean, there really is a way God has designed us. That's why we're a part of the body of Christ. We're baptized into the church the way God has designed it. So the way that I think about it, when we lived overseas, every now and then we would get to go on a U.S. Army base, which you're actually on U.S. soil. And it's not just technicality, like it's really American architecture. It's, Taco Bell and Pizza Hut, and the sirens on the police cars make the right sound. And I mean, so it's like you're home, you use dollars, but you're actually thousands of miles from home, but you get this taste of home that really you feel it. And that's what corporate worship is for, being a part of the body. So that's casually dechurching. Make it a priority. Find a church. There are many websites and people that can help you to do it. But so that's one. For the dechurch casualties, maybe the ex-evangelicals, a lot of them, from the stories I've heard, I would want to affirm them. They should have left that church. Yeah, they should. Like, I hear some of the political syncretism, the abuse, the misogyny, yes, you should. Well done for leaving that church. But it doesn't mean that you have to leave the church. And it doesn't mean there's not a church that, although there's a perfect church, it doesn't mean there's not a church that's still actually very aligned with what you value. And there are a lot of people who would love to, I would love for that person, if I was in their life. It's a little more difficult because I have a Sunday morning gig, but if I would just love to hear their story and say, well, let's do this together. I'll go with you. The first time we'll meet with the leaders together and ask them questions. What would prevent this? What happened to you at the last church, at this church? So I've got a lot of compassion for them, but I would encourage them that Jesus called you into the body.
Awesome. Yeah. Mike, what about you?
I want to talk to the dechurched casualties first who are listening. And the first thing I want to say is, I'm sorry. I doubt whatever church that you were at that was painful, or whatever person or institution hurt you or harmed you, I doubt that you're probably going to get an I'm sorry from,
probably not,
from that context. But just as somebody who's ordained and a minister of the gospel, I just want you to hear, I'm really sorry, and Jesus really does care. I think sometimes we don't have the time for this, and I don't tell these stories. If you want to talk about church hurt, you should talk to also some pastors. It's not safe to assume that just because someone is still clergy they have gone through some really similar and really horrific experiences. I have that in my story. I've yet to. I'll probably never tell those stories publicly.
Yeah, same here.
So it's just. So I just want you to know that there are other people. You're not alone. There are other people who have had similar, probably similar experiences to you. But I think about that question in John 6 of who else has Jesus, who else has the words of life. Look, if somebody else had the words of life, fine, I would go there, but I don't know who else does. And Jesus really does love me, and he does love you, and he also loves his church and gave up his life for his church. The mission that he was given by God the Father was to go and yes, redeem all of creation, from the curse, as far as the curse was found, yes. But there's also the redemption for this specific, people, his church. So, Jesus died for, the invisible church. And so I just want to say that, that Jesus died for these things. He does love you. He does care about these things. And he wants to help you bear the pain of the burdens that you're carrying. And I want to say that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. And at the foot of the cross there is tremendous healing, and we can take those things and we have a God who is just. He is just. Everything that's wrong will be squared and made right. Now, that may not be
look like it right now.
like our timetable and the way that we would want it and all of these different kinds of things, but make no mistake, God will make everything that is crooked will be made straight.
Yep.
And so, the reason why, part of the reason why I don't tell my story, on church abuse and these different kinds of things is because I have taken those things to the foot of the cross, and I didn't feel the need to take them further. Now, other people might feel differently, and that's totally fine. That's their prerogative. It's just not my story.
Yeah.
And so God loves us, and he wants us to be connected to his church. And look, there's tremendous pain, and that this is part of being connected to something means that if you're going to be in a church, you're going to get hurt. Okay. It's not a question of if, it's really just when and how bad, and what do you do with that. And so that doesn't mean that doing this is a form of like self-flagellation or some kind of masochism or anything like that. Nobody, God's not calling you to those things. Obviously find healthy churches with people who are emotionally well adjusted and on this path to maturity. For those who are casual Christians, I would just encourage people to think about what you're missing from being disconnected to those things, and think about the value that's there. When you think about the 59 one another's in the New Testament, over half of them you can't do apart from being physically together, and so you're really missing out on a lot, from being disconnected to the church body. So, and you don't have to go back to what you left. You can find, I think in most instances, in most contexts, you can find a healthier local church than that you left, and that's okay. Calling for a massive reshuffling of the deck, but some shuffling of the deck is probably not a bad thing. And look, at the end of the day, if you were at a church where the Jesus flag wasn't the highest and most important flag that was there, well, find a local church where the Jesus flag is the most important thing, that's there. So those would just be a couple words that I would have, pastoral.
Yeah. And I know I'm not one of the guests, but if I may add kind of a background of, this is pretty relevant to me, just on, I'm an ex-dechurched person. So there's another category. So this 2023,
sort of similar to me too.
Yeah, 2023 marks actually 10 years where I came back to the church. And all it took was my next door neighbor in Seattle, who's a couple girls. They were going to an Acts 29 church, Calvinistic Acts 29 church. They had community groups and Bible studies, and they led with friendship. They became my friend first, invited me over, hospitality. I got to know their other people from the church, and then after a while, I think about good 6 months, I finally started going to their church because I was praying with them in their living room for a while, asking questions. And then that's how it started. And if you would have told me 10 years ago I'd be co-hosting a Christian podcast, I wouldn't believe you.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. No, I had relatively, similar. I went to a big church and then nobody knew who I was. And so it was really easy to fall off, as I'm assuming it is for a lot of other people. Well, Mike, you're the last man standing. We have we had Jim, who just had to leave to go off to something else, and Ryan, we had him on for a hot minute. So we could still say all three of you guys were on at one point in time.
Yeah.
But it's been a pleasure having all three of you on, and you, Mike, on to talk about this. Not just kind of theoretical, but like really personal. This is really personal stuff that really hits hard. And we're going through kind of a loneliness epidemic of sorts. So it's, when you're not part of the church, that hits pretty hard. I preach at basically a commuter church. And so there's very little community at the church. Even though it's a church, people don't really get together outside of Sunday mornings, which is great that we get together, but it's hard. So it's like, I get aspects of this, but it's been, it was a really, really eye-opening read. because you kind of think it's going to confirm what you already think, and then you're like, oh no, this goes against more or less everything I thought, which is good because it wakes me up to the actual real statistics out there, the statistical models you guys bring up, the theological ramifications that are part of this, and the practical help. So thank you so much for your work at the Keller Center, for your work with this book, your guys' podcast. It's been a pleasure having you guys on.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been a pleasure, and blessings on you and everybody who's listening.
Awesome.